My mother actually canceled the RSVPs for all 47 relatives on my side of the family. She sent a mass text telling them not to be the only fool who shows up to support me. So on my wedding day, my entire side of the aisle sat completely empty. I walked through the heavy church doors completely alone. But just as the whispers started, the heavy oak side doors opened. A line of powerful people in dark suits filled every single empty chair. From her leased car in the parking lot, my mother grabbed my father by the arm and pointed, her face turning pale. "That is not possible," she stammered. "Let me tell you exactly how I ruined my mother's perfect illusion and protected my grandfather's true legacy." I stood in the quiet vestibule of the church, clutching my bridal bouquet so tightly my knuckles turned white. The heavy silk of my wedding gown rustled softly around my ankles, but the only sound I could focus on was the quiet buzzing of my phone. I looked down at the illuminated screen and read the group text message my mother Beatrice had just sent to our entire extended family. "I have canceled the RSVPs for all 47 of us," it read. "Do not be the only fool who shows up to support a daughter who embarrasses this family's pedigree." My chest tightened, but I refused to let a single tear ruin my makeup. This was exactly who my mother was. For my entire 32 years of life, Beatrice had been obsessed with maintaining a flawless image of elite high society wealth. She spent her days aggressively climbing the social ladder, desperate to secure her place among the most exclusive country clubs and charity boards in the city. To her, I was nothing but the ultimate disappointment. I was the scapegoat daughter who refused to follow my sister Chantel into the pristine world of medicine or corporate law. Instead, I chose a path my mother constantly described as playing in the dirt. She had no idea that my commercial real estate development firm was quietly buying up and restoring historic Black neighborhoods across the state, making me more successful than she could ever comprehend. I put my phone away and signaled the wedding coordinator that I was ready. The grand double door swung open, revealing the breathtaking interior of the sanctuary. The contrast inside was instantly paralyzing. To my right sat the family and friends of my groom Jamal. His side of the church was overflowing with joyous people. Jamal owned a massive interstate logistics and trucking company, and his seats were packed with his loving relatives, loyal employees, and lifelong friends. They were smiling and whispering in anticipation. But to my left, the reality of my mother's toxicity was on full display. 47 chairs sat painfully empty. The entire left side of the sanctuary was a barren wasteland of white folding chairs and unused wedding programs. The silence from that side of the room was deafening. I kept my head held high and began my walk down the aisle. At the altar, Jamal stood looking incredibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo. His dark eyes met mine, filled with a calm, protective strength that anchored my soul. He saw the empty chairs, but his expression never wavered. He simply stepped forward, reaching his hand out to pull me toward him. Before I could reach the altar, a loud, disruptive squeaking noise echoed from the back of the church. The sound of rubber golf shoes aggressively scuffing against the polished hardwood floor made several guests turn around. It was my sister Chantel and her husband Preston. Chantel was my mother's undisputed golden child. She was spoiled, vain, and completely dependent on our parents to fund her fake, luxurious lifestyle. Preston was a white finance broker with a colossal ego who constantly used his race and his supposed wealth to condescend to our family. He loved playing the white savior, acting as though his mere presence elevated our social standing. They strolled casually up the empty side of the aisle, completely ignoring the solemnity of the ceremony. Both of them were dressed in bright pastel golf attire, looking as though they had just stepped off the 18th hole. "We had to pause our country club brunch to witness this ghetto mess," Preston announced, his voice carrying loudly across the quiet sanctuary. He crossed his arms and looked at the 47 empty chairs with a smug, condescending smirk. "I guess nobody wanted to waste their Saturday on you two play pretend entrepreneurs." Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He casually tossed it onto one of the empty chairs. "Here, let me help pay for these cheap folding chairs," he sneered. "You guys clearly need the charity." Chantel giggled, covering her mouth with her hand, looking at me with pure, unfiltered disdain. Jamal immediately stiffened, his jaw clenching as he took a step toward Preston. I gently squeezed Jamal's hand, pulling him back. I did not shed a single tear, and I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Preston's arrogant face and smiled. Then I turned my attention to the pastor and gave him a subtle nod. The pastor stepped back from the microphone. Suddenly, the heavy oak side doors near the front of the church swung open with a resounding thud. The entire congregation turned to look. Through the doors marched 50 of the most distinguished, powerful, older African American men and women in the state. They moved with absolute authority, their presence instantly commanding the respect of every person in the room. They wore impeccably tailored dark suits and elegant dresses. These were not rented extras. These were elite federal judges, top-tier bank executives, and the highest-ranking elders of the Divine Nine fraternities and sororities. They were the very definition of Black excellence. And more importantly, they were my late grandfather Silas's inner circle. Grandpa Silas had been a quiet self-made real estate mogul who amassed incredible wealth without ever seeking the superficial spotlight my mother so desperately craved. Before he passed away 5 years ago, he told these esteemed men and women to watch over me. Today they had come to fulfill that promise. They filed into the church, their footsteps echoing with dignified purpose. They walked right past Preston and Chantel, completely ignoring their pastel golf outfits and their petty insults. One by one, these 50 titans of industry filled every single empty chair on my side of the aisle. The older gentlemen respectfully bowed their heads to me as they took their seats, while the women offered warm, encouraging smiles. Preston's smug grin vanished instantly. The color drained from his face as he recognized a prominent Superior Court judge sitting right in the front row. Chantel looked around in absolute confusion, her arrogant posture crumbling under the weight of the immense power now occupying the room. They quickly scuttled to the very back of the church, suddenly looking like the foolish, uninvited guests they truly were. Outside the church, the warm afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot. My mother Beatrice sat comfortably in the air-conditioned leather interior of her leased Mercedes-Benz. She had forced my spineless father to stay in the passenger seat, actively preventing him from walking his own daughter down the aisle. She wanted to sit there and relish the thought of my public humiliation. She wanted to picture me crying alone at the altar. But as the ceremony progressed, she noticed the fleet of black town cars and luxury sedans pulling into the VIP parking spaces near the side entrance. Through her tinted windows, Beatrice watched closely. She saw the governor's chief of staff step out of a car. She saw the president of the largest Black-owned investment bank in the city. She saw the elite circle of high society individuals that she had spent decades trying to bribe, flatter, and beg her way into. My mother grabbed my father's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "That is not possible," she stammered, her eyes wide with shock. "What are they doing here? Why are they going inside?" She watched in absolute horror as the most powerful people in the city walked into the church to support the daughter she had just labeled a broke joke. Her mind could not process the reality unfolding before her. The elite society she worshipped was actively bowing to the scapegoat daughter she despised. The psychological break was immediate. Her illusion of control was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The ceremony concluded beautifully. Jamal kissed me, and the entire church erupted in genuine, joyous applause. The distinguished elders clapped the loudest, their presence validating every sacrifice and struggle I had endured to build my business. Jamal and I walked back up the aisle hand in hand, leaving Preston and Chantel fuming in the back row. We transitioned seamlessly to the luxury resort where the reception was being held. The resort was a sprawling, magnificent property with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a pristine private lake. The guests took their seats buzzing with excitement about the incredible ceremony they had just witnessed. The atmosphere was filled with love and triumph. But my mother could not handle the loss of control. The realization that I commanded the respect of the city's true elite had driven her to the brink of madness. She aggressively dragged my father out of the Mercedes and stormed into the reception hall just as the best man was preparing to give his toast. Beatrice burst through the grand ballroom doors. Her face twisted in a mask of furious desperation. She marched straight toward the sweetheart table where Jamal and I were sitting. She did not care about the hundreds of eyes turning to look at her. She did not care about the distinguished guests sitting in the front rows. She only cared about tearing me down and reclaiming her false sense of superiority. "Who paid you people to be here?" Beatrice screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the judges and bank executives sitting calmly at their tables. "My daughter is a broke joke. There is no way she knows any of you. She is a failure who plays in the dirt for a living. She is an embarrassment to this family." The entire ballroom fell silent. The music stopped. The guests stared in shock at the unhinged woman screaming in the middle of a luxury reception. Preston and Chantel quickly followed Beatrice into the room, emboldened by my mother's outburst. Preston marched up to our table, puffing out his chest and acting like the wealthy savior he always pretended to be. "Let us end this charade," Preston sneered, pulling a heavy metal platinum credit card from his wallet and slamming it down right onto my dinner plate. "I will buy out this cheap banquet hall, so Chantel does not have to breathe this air anymore. You two play pretend entrepreneurs are a joke. You probably maxed out a dozen credit cards just to rent this room for a few hours." Beatrice nodded vigorously, standing behind Preston like a proud general backing up her favorite soldier. "She has always been a failure," Beatrice yelled to the crowd. "She refused to go to medical school like my beautiful Chantel. She has no money and no future. This whole wedding is a scam to make her look important." I looked down at the platinum card sitting on my plate. I did not yell back. I did not defend my career choices. I calmly reached out and pushed Preston's credit card off the table, letting it clatter onto the floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of my wedding gown, and looked directly at my mother. Then I raised my hand and signaled toward the back of the room. The general manager of the luxury resort immediately stepped forward. He was a highly respected professional who managed properties worldwide. He walked briskly to the sweetheart table, completely ignoring my mother's hysterical presence. He stopped in front of me and bowed slightly, holding a leather-bound financial folder. "Excuse the interruption, ma'am," the manager said, his voice projecting clearly across the silent ballroom. "I just wanted to provide the evening update as requested. Your resort's quarterly profits are up 18% this month. The new expansion plans you approved have already generated unprecedented revenue." The ballroom was dead silent. My mother's jaw literally dropped. Preston's arrogant sneer vanished, completely replaced by a look of sheer panicked confusion. They heard the manager perfectly. He did not say the resort. He said your resort. I own the entire multi-million-dollar luxury complex. Every chandelier, every marble floor, every perfectly manicured acre of land belonged entirely to me. My commercial real estate firm had purchased and renovated the property 2 years ago, turning it into the most profitable venue in the state. I was not renting a room for a few hours. I was hosting my wedding in my own building. Beatrice stumbled backward, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. She looked around the magnificent ballroom, suddenly realizing the true scale of my wealth and power. "You!" she gasped, her voice trembling. "Where did you get the money for this? This is impossible. The money your grandfather left behind was supposed to belong to me and Preston for our investments. You stole it." Her accidental outburst echoed through the room. In her state of pure shock, she had just publicly admitted her darkest secret. She had expected to inherit my grandfather's massive fortune and planned to hand it over to her white son-in-law to fund his fraudulent finance schemes. She had no idea that Grandpa Silas knew exactly who she was and had made brilliant, unbreakable plans to protect his empire from her greedy hands. Preston, completely humiliated and desperate to save face in front of the elite crowd, snatched his platinum card off the floor. He stormed over to the main bar, ignoring the shocked stares of the guests. "Pour me your most expensive bottle of champagne," he demanded loudly, trying to project wealth and authority. "I am paying for it right now." The bartender calmly took the card and swiped it through the terminal. The machine immediately blared a loud, sharp error tone. The screen flashed bright red. The bartender looked at the terminal, then looked directly at Preston. Sir, your card has been declined," the bartender announced, his voice carrying over the quiet chatter of the room. "Actually, sir, the bank message says this card has been seized for suspected fraudulent activity." Preston turned stark white. He grabbed the card back, his hands shaking violently. Before he could utter a single excuse, his cell phone began ringing frantically in his pocket. He pulled it out, staring at the caller ID with wide, terrified eyes. The carefully constructed illusion of his wealthy elite lifestyle was imploding right in the middle of my reception hall, and the absolute worst was still yet to come. 2 weeks had passed since the catastrophic events of my wedding day, but my mother Beatrice refused to accept the reality of her shattered social standing. Desperate to rebuild her crumbling image and regain control of the family narrative, she decided to host a massive Sunday family cookout at her sprawling suburban home. She deliberately sent out invitations to the 47 relatives who had missed the wedding, feeding them a steady stream of manipulative lies. She spent 14 straight days gaslighting the entire family, calling every aunt, uncle, and cousin to spin a completely fabricated story. She claimed that I had scammed a major bank to somehow buy the resort, and that the distinguished elders who attended my ceremony were nothing but paid actors hired to embarrass her. She painted herself as the tragic victim of an ungrateful, mentally unstable daughter. To ensure my attendance, Beatrice held a particularly cruel piece of leverage over my head. She was illegally withholding the last remaining personal effects of Grandpa Silas, including his cherished pocket watch and a collection of handwritten letters he had intended for me. She sent a cold text message stating that if Jamal and I did not show up to the cookout to publicly apologize to the family, she would throw the irreplaceable heirlooms into the incinerator. Jamal and I arrived at the cookout just as the afternoon sun began casting long shadows over the manicured lawn. The backyard was packed with the 47 relatives who had been noticeably absent from my wedding. The atmosphere was thick with tension and whispered gossip as we walked through the side gate. Aunts who used to greet me with warm hugs now averted their eyes, while uncles muttered under their breath, sipping their drinks from red plastic cups. My mother stood near the patio, looking incredibly smug, holding a glass of iced tea like a queen surveying her loyal subjects. She had successfully turned my own blood against me, using her tears and her talent for manipulation to convince them that I was a criminal who had disgraced our family name. But the real spectacle was unfolding near the center of the yard, where Chantel and her white husband Preston were holding court. Preston looked surprisingly arrogant for a man whose credit cards had been seized for federal fraud just 2 weeks prior. He stood tall, wearing crisp khaki shorts and a pastel button-down shirt, projecting the image of a wealthy savior. Chantel stood beside him, beaming with an unwarranted sense of pride as she clutched a thick manila folder to her chest. "Can I get the attention of the family?" Preston shouted over the sound of the outdoor speakers, waving his hands to gather everyone around the large stone fire pit. The relatives quickly formed a circle, their eyes fixed on the golden child and her supposedly successful husband. Preston waited until the yard was completely silent before putting his arm around Chantel and puffing out his chest. As many of you know, the historic commercial district that Grandpa Silas built was quietly facing severe foreclosure due to some unfortunate mismanagement. Preston announced, his voice dripping with condescension. He shot a glaring look in my direction, making sure the entire family noticed. "But you do not need to worry anymore, because I used my elite financial connections and my personal wealth to rescue the property from the bank. It officially belongs to me and Chantel now. We hold the true and legal deed to the land." The family erupted into immediate applause and cheers. Aunts and uncles clapped enthusiastically, praising the white son-in-law for swooping in to save the family legacy. Beatrice wiped a fake tear from her eye, shouting loudly about how blessed they were to have such a generous, brilliant man in the family. Chantel held up a piece of paper from the manila folder, waving it around like a trophy. "We are going to honor the legacy of Grandpa Silas by bulldozing those old rundown buildings and developing a state-of-the-art, luxury condominium complex." Preston continued, soaking up the adoration of my relatives. "We are bringing real value to this family, something certain people simply do not have the capacity to do." The relatives cheered again, looking at me with undisguised disappointment and judgment. They genuinely believed the lies my mother had fed them. They believed Preston was their wealthy savior, and that I was nothing but a bitter failure trying to steal the spotlight. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost impressive. Preston stood there, basking in the glow of his white privilege, assuming his lies would simply be accepted as absolute truth, because of his race and his perceived status. I did not raise my voice. I did not let the angry murmurs of my relatives break my composure. I simply adjusted my jacket and calmly stepped forward, walking directly toward the large grill area where the family was gathered. The crowd parted slightly, allowing me to pass, though the glares they directed at me were heavy with contempt. Jamal walked a few paces behind me, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase, his expression dangerously calm. I stopped right in front of Preston and Chantel. The cheering died down as the family waited to see how I would react to my supposed defeat. Preston smirked down at me, looking incredibly satisfied with his theatrical display. "That is a very compelling story, Preston," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily across the silent backyard. "But there is a rather significant problem with your announcement." I turned slightly and gestured to Jamal. He stepped forward, opening the leather briefcase with a satisfying click. He pulled out a thick certified legal folder sealed with official government stamps and handed it directly to me. I did not hand the documents to Preston or my mother. Instead, I turned to my Uncle Marcus, the loudest and most respected elder among the relatives present today. I handed the heavy folder to him. "Uncle Marcus," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Preston, "you have been working in real estate law for over 30 years. Please tell the family what you are holding." Uncle Marcus adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. He pulled out the documents, examining the official watermarks and the raised notary seals. The yard was so quiet you could hear the breeze rustling through the oak trees. His eyes widened as he read the first page, his hands trembling slightly. "This is an irrevocable blind trust document," Uncle Marcus announced, his voice carrying a note of profound shock. "It is fully authenticated and registered with the federal government." He flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. "According to these records, the entire $40 million commercial district was transferred directly into this blind trust by Silas 5 full years ago, long before his death. The property was never in foreclosure. It was never owned by the bank." The smug smile on the face of Preston vanished instantly. The color drained from his cheeks and he took a sudden nervous step backward. Chantel lowered the piece of paper she had been waving, her confusion evident as the triumphant atmosphere of the cookout rapidly dissolved into tense uncertainty. "And who is listed as the sole executor of that trust, Uncle Marcus?" I asked, my voice smooth and unyielding. Uncle Marcus swallowed hard, looking up from the papers and staring directly at me. "Kiara is the sole executor," he read aloud, his voice shaking. "She has absolute total control over the entire $40 million commercial property and all associated assets. Grandpa Silas left it entirely to her." The backyard erupted into chaos. Aunts and uncles gasped in shock, looking back and forth between the certified documents in the hands of Uncle Marcus and the sudden panicked expression on the face of Preston. The narrative my mother had spent 2 weeks meticulously building was collapsing in front of her eyes. "That is a lie!" Beatrice screamed, pushing her way to the front of the crowd, her face twisted in rage. "She is making this up. She forged those documents to steal from her own sister." Preston showed us the real deed. I turned to face my mother, my expression completely neutral. "The deed Preston is holding is a complete and utter forgery," I stated clearly, addressing the entire crowd. "Grandpa Silas never left a single brick of that property to you, Beatrice. He knew exactly what you would do with it. He knew you would hand it over to a fraudulent white broker just to maintain your fake social status. He placed the property into a blind trust, specifically to protect the legacy of our community from being bulldozed and gentrified by people like Preston." The relatives started murmuring loudly, pointing at the piece of paper Chantel was holding. The sudden realization that they had been lied to and manipulated by my mother was setting in. The respect they had just shown to Preston was rapidly morphing into intense scrutiny. Preston, realizing he was completely cornered, decided to double down on his arrogance. He stepped aggressively into the personal space of Jamal, attempting to use physical intimidation to regain control of the situation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my husband, his face red with a mixture of fear and fury. "You listen to me, you thug!" Preston spat, his true racist nature bleeding through his polished country club facade. I do not know what kind of illegal ghetto scam you two are running, but I have powerful lawyers. I will have you thrown in jail for threatening me. I will call the police right now and have you both arrested for trespassing and forgery." Jamal did not flinch. He stood his ground, towering over Preston with a calm, intimidating presence that required absolutely no effort. Jamal simply looked down at the shaking finger of Preston and smiled a slow, chilling smile. "You do not need to call the police." Preston Jamal said, his voice deep and rumbling with quiet authority. "They are already here, right on cue." The heavy wooden gate at the side of the yard swung open. The loud, chaotic arguments of the family abruptly died down as three figures stepped into the backyard. Two uniformed city police officers flanked a stern-looking man in a plain business suit. The heavy boots of the officers crunched against the gravel path as they walked with absolute purpose directly toward the center of the yard. The relatives parted like the Red Sea, stepping back in total shock as the authorities moved through the crowd. My mother froze, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. Chantel dropped her fake deed onto the grass, backing away from her husband as if he were suddenly radioactive. The man in the business suit stopped directly in front of Preston. The two police officers took strategic positions on either side of the terrified finance broker, blocking any possible route of escape. The entire family watched in stunned disbelief as the carefully constructed, wealthy white savior facade of Preston was systematically dismantled in their own backyard. "Are you Preston Matthews?" the man in the suit asked, his tone strictly professional. Preston was trembling so violently he could barely speak. He stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the police officers and the surrounding crowd of relatives. "What is this about? I have done nothing wrong." The man in the suit pulled a thick, heavy stack of legal documents from his satchel and pressed them forcefully against the chest of Preston, forcing him to take them. "Preston Matthews, you are being officially served," the process server announced, his voice projecting loudly enough for every single aunt, uncle, and cousin to hear clearly. "You are being served with a federal subpoena for extensive cross-collateralization fraud, multiple counts of wire fraud, and grand federal embezzlement. You are ordered to appear in federal court tomorrow morning to surrender your passport and face these charges." The heavy stack of federal documents slipped from the trembling hands of Preston, scattering across the manicured lawn of my mother. The silence in the backyard was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The 47 relatives who had boycotted my wedding because they thought I was a failure were now standing in the middle of a cookout, watching the golden child husband face federal prison time for stealing millions of dollars. My mother looked at the scattered federal papers and then looked at me, her entire world collapsing into a pile of undeniable, humiliating truth. The absolute panic that engulfed the backyard of my mother was immediate and totally uncontrollable. The 47 relatives who had just spent the entire afternoon cheering for Preston were now scrambling away from him as if his federal subpoena were a contagious disease. Aunts grabbed their children and pulled them back toward the patio, while uncles whispered furiously to each other, completely abandoning their red plastic cups on the perfectly manicured lawn. Preston stood entirely frozen, staring down at the thick, heavy stack of federal documents scattered around his expensive pastel golf shoes. His carefully constructed facade of white privilege and financial superiority had been completely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. Chantel was hyperventilating, clutching her chest, and demanding that someone call an ambulance because she claimed she was having a panic attack. Nobody moved to help her. My mother Beatrice looked absolutely terrified for the first time in her life. She was not terrified for Preston or for Chantel. She was terrified because her beloved country club status was about to be destroyed the moment her elite friends found out her golden son-in-law was a federal criminal facing prison time. She knew that in the circles of the black elite, a scandal involving embezzlement and cross-collateralization fraud was the ultimate social death sentence. "This is a setup!" Preston suddenly screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at me and Jamal. "This is a racist setup orchestrated by her and her shady associates. They forged these documents to frame me. I am an upstanding finance broker. I have powerful friends who will ruin you for this." Jamal did not even blink. He simply crossed his arms over his chest and looked at Preston with a chilling, calm expression. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not hand out fake subpoenas. Preston Jamal said, his voice low and dangerous. You stole millions of dollars by forging signatures and committing wire fraud. You can scream racism all you want, but the only color the federal government cares about right now is the green you embezzled. Beatrice, realizing the severity of the situation, immediately switched into total survival mode. She rushed over to Preston, stepping right over the scattered federal documents, and grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the back door of the house. Chantel followed them, sobbing hysterically about how her luxury life was being ruined. The 47 relatives watched in stunned silence as the hosts of the cookout fled into the house, abandoning their own party. Jamal and I did not stay to watch the aftermath. We had delivered the killing blow to their false narrative, and we knew exactly what the next move of my mother would be. By 8 o'clock the next morning, my phone was ringing incessantly. Beatrice was leaving frantic voicemails, demanding that I meet her at the high-end corporate boardroom of the old family business. She insisted it was a matter of life and death for the family legacy. I knew she was terrified of losing her social standing if Preston went to prison, so she was desperately trying to find a way to cover his tracks. I texted her back, agreeing to meet at noon. I did not tell her that I would not be coming alone. The corporate boardroom was located on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper. The walls were made of frosted glass, and the massive mahogany table dominated the center of the room. When I walked through the double doors, Beatrice and Chantel were already waiting. They looked completely exhausted, their eyes red and puffy from crying all night. Preston was not there, likely meeting with his criminal defense attorneys. My spineless father sat quietly in the corner, staring blankly out the window, having been dragged there to serve as a silent prop for my mother. "Close the door, Kiara!" Beatrice snapped the moment I walked in, her tone reverting immediately to her usual toxic authority. "We have a massive crisis to deal with, and you are going to help us fix it." I walked to the other side of the mahogany table, but I did not sit down. I crossed my arms and looked at her. "I am not fixing anything for you," I stated clearly. "You spent 2 weeks lying to the entire family about me. You tried to claim I scammed a bank to buy my resort. You let Preston stand in your backyard and take credit for saving the property of Grandpa Silas when you knew he was lying. You created this mess." Chantel slammed her hands on the table. "Preston is facing 15 years in federal prison, Kiara," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "The bank is threatening to freeze all of our accounts. They say he used false collateral to secure his loans. You have to sign over the blind trust to him right now." I raised an eyebrow, staring at my sister in sheer disbelief. "You want me to hand over a $40 million commercial district to a man who just got served a federal subpoena for fraud, so he can use it to pay off his illegal debts?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure sarcasm. "Are you actually insane or just completely delusional?" Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes flashing with desperate venom. She was cornered and she knew it, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left, which was blatant emotional blackmail and unhinged threats. "You will sign those papers," Kiara, Beatrice threatened, slamming a pen down on the table. "If you do not sign this over to Preston right now, I will call every single news outlet in the city. I will tell the entire city that you abused your dying grandfather to steal his money. I will say you manipulated a sick old man into changing his trust documents. I will destroy your business reputation permanently." The sheer audacity of her threat was staggering. She was perfectly willing to destroy my entire life and drag the honorable legacy of my grandfather through the mud just to protect a white criminal who had married her favorite daughter solely for financial gain. She thought her threat would terrify me into submission the way it always had when I was a child. She thought I would crumble under the weight of her toxic matriarchal dominance. I did not crumble. I did not yield an inch. I looked at the pen on the table, and then I looked directly into the furious eyes of my mother. "I refuse to sign anything," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper. "And you are not going to call the news outlets, Beatrice. Because if you make one single phone call, you will be sharing a federal prison cell with your beloved son-in-law." Before Beatrice could respond to my refusal, I turned around and walked back to the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom. I pushed them wide open. Waiting in the reception area were three of the distinguished older men in dark suits who had attended my wedding. They walked into the boardroom with the kind of silent, terrifying authority that only comes from possessing absolute institutional power. They were the board of directors of the largest black-owned investment bank in the state, the very same bank that Preston had allegedly been doing business with. The color drained from the face of my mother so fast, she looked physically ill. Chantel backed away from the table, her eyes darting frantically between the three powerful executives. My father finally stood up from his chair in the corner, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple family argument. The lead director, a tall, imposing man with silver hair, walked straight to the mahogany table. He did not greet my mother. He did not acknowledge my sister. He unclasped a thick leather satchel and pulled out several stacks of heavily audited financial statements, dropping them onto the polished wood surface with a loud, definitive slap. "We have spent the last 48 hours conducting a comprehensive forensic audit of all accounts associated with Preston Matthews and this family," the director announced, his voice booming through the quiet boardroom. "The results of this audit have already been turned over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." "What are you talking about?" Beatrice stammered, her hands shaking as she stared at the stacks of paper. "You have no right to look into our personal finances." "We have every right when those finances involve extensive federal bank fraud," the director corrected sharply. "These audited statements reveal that Preston has been systematically forging the signature of Silas for the past 3 years. He used those forged documents to secure massive illegal loans, claiming he had access to the commercial district. But worse than that, we discovered where the rest of his funding came from." The director slid a specific stack of highlighted papers across the table directly toward my mother. Beatrice stared at the papers as if they were covered in poison. "These documents prove that you knew exactly what Preston was doing." "Beatrice," the director continued, his tone laced with absolute disgust, "you actively allowed Preston to drain the entire retirement account of your own husband to fund the designer lifestyle of Chantel. You authorized multiple wire transfers to cover his failing margins because you desperately needed Chantel and Preston to look like the wealthiest couple at your elite country club. You sacrificed the financial security of your own family just to maintain a fake high society image." Chantel let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth as she looked at our mother. "You drained the retirement accounts!" Chantel shrieked, her fake victim persona instantly activating. "You told me Preston was making millions in the market. You told me his investments were paying for my lifestyle. He was broke, Chantel." I interjected, my voice slicing through her pathetic performance. "Your husband has been completely broke for years. He is a fraud who married into this family because Beatrice promised him access to the wealth of Grandpa Silas. The luxury cars, the designer bags, the country club memberships, they were all paid for with stolen money and illegal credit. Your entire perfect life is a literal federal crime." The reality of the situation hit them like a freight train. The entire family was officially totally bankrupt. They were living entirely on stolen credit and forged signatures. My father stumbled backward, falling heavily into his chair as he realized his entire life savings had been secretly drained by his own wife to fund the arrogant lifestyle of his white son-in-law. The illusion of their superior elite status was not just broken, it was completely incinerated. Beatrice was backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. The federal evidence was sitting right there on the table. Her country club friends would find out. Her charity board associates would find out. The 47 relatives she had lied to would find out that she was completely broke and complicit in massive federal embezzlement. The absolute terror of losing her social standing completely broke her mind. She let out a visceral, guttural scream of pure, desperate rage. She violently lunged across the wide mahogany table, her hands clawing frantically at the audited financial statements. She grabbed the thick stacks of paper, tearing them aggressively, ripping the pages into shreds and throwing them onto the floor as if destroying the physical copies would somehow erase the digital records stored on the federal servers. She was screaming incoherently, entirely losing her mind, as the executives watched her pathetic, destructive breakdown in total silence. Beatrice swept her arms wildly across the polished mahogany surface, knocking over water glasses and leather binders, in her desperate attempt to shred every single piece of evidence she could reach. The heavy glass pitchers shattered against the hardwood floor, sending water and shards of glass everywhere, but she did not care. She continued ripping the documents, screaming that we were all trying to destroy her perfect family, and that she would not allow anyone to take away the pristine reputation she had spent her entire life building. Chantal dropped to her knees, sobbing loudly as she tried to gather the torn pieces of paper, completely unable to accept that her fake billionaire lifestyle was officially over forever. Jamal stepped forward, pulling me safely away from the chaotic center of the room as my mother completely lost her grip on reality. The three bank directors simply stood there watching the absolute implosion of a toxic matriarch who had finally been crushed. "I gave you life!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking as she unleashed the ultimate toxic matriarch line she had used to control me since childhood. "You owe me everything, Kiara. You will sign that trust over, and you will let Preston take this fall, or you are dead to me." I stood perfectly still, watching the pathetic display of a woman who cared more about her country club status than her own flesh and blood. Chantal was hyperventilating on the floor, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the torn pieces of evidence. She looked up at me with tears ruining her expensive makeup. "You destroyed my marriage." Kiara Chantal shrieked, her fake victim persona instantly taking over. "Preston is facing federal prison because of you. You were always jealous of my perfect life, and now you have ruined everything." Before I could even process the sheer delusion of my sister, the frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open again. Preston walked in looking completely disheveled and panicked. He must have slipped past his lawyers and come straight here looking for a way to manipulate my mother into saving him. But the moment he saw the bank directors standing calmly in the room and the shredded evidence scattered across the floor, he knew it was over. The wealthy white savior facade dropped completely, and his true colors finally emerged in all their racist, greedy glory. "You stupid, gullible fools!" Preston screamed, turning entirely on Chantal and Beatrice. His face was twisted in a mask of pure contempt as he looked down at his sobbing wife. "You think I actually wanted to marry into this family? You think I wanted to spend my life pretending to care about your pathetic social climbing? I only married you because Beatrice promised me absolute unrestricted access to the wealth of Grandpa Silas. She told me the blind trust would be mine the moment the old man died. You were nothing but a convenient stepping stone to millions of dollars." Chantal let out a gut-wrenching wail, clutching her stomach as the horrifying reality of her marriage crashed down on her. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck, acting superior because she had a rich white husband, and now that very husband was standing in front of her, admitting he had used her as a cheap pawn to commit federal fraud. Beatrice stopped tearing the papers, staring at Preston with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. "How dare you speak to us like that?" Beatrice snarled, her hands shaking. "I covered your tracks for 3 years. I drained the retirement accounts of my own husband to pay your margins so you could look successful. And you were dumb enough to do it." Preston laughed maliciously, running a hand through his messy hair. "You cared so much about looking like the elite black family that you literally gave away your entire financial future to a white guy you barely knew. You handed me everything on a silver platter, just so you could brag to your little charity boards. You deserve exactly what is coming to you, Beatrice." Preston took an aggressive step toward me, his eyes filled with desperate rage. "And you," Preston hissed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are going to sign that property over to me right now, so I can pay off the feds. I am not going to prison because some arrogant scapegoat daughter decided to play real estate mogul." He lunged forward, but he never even made it within arm reach of me. Jamal moved with blinding speed, stepping squarely between Preston and me. The physical difference between them was staggering. Jamal was a man who had built a massive interstate trucking empire from the ground up, working long, brutal hours and dealing with tough men every single day. Preston was a coward who spent his life hiding behind tailored suits and forged signatures. Jamal grabbed Preston by the collar of his expensive shirt, lifting him slightly off the polished hardwood floor and physically backing the trembling coward into the corner of the boardroom. "You need to sit down and close your mouth right now," Preston Jamal said, his voice deep and rumbling with a quiet, terrifying authority. "If you take one more step toward my wife, I will personally ensure that the feds have to pick you up in an ambulance before they take you to prison. Do you understand me?" Preston swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear as he nodded frantically. Jamal released his collar, letting Preston slide down the wall and slump into an empty chair, completely neutralized. The sudden violent shift in power left the room in stunned silence. I turned my attention back to my mother, who was still breathing heavily, surrounded by the shredded remains of the financial audit. "Tearing up the paper does absolutely nothing, Beatrice," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm, echoing in the quiet room. "You can rip up every single sheet you find, but those are just copies. The bank executives sitting right in front of you have digital federally secured backups of every single fraudulent transaction you and Preston made. The Federal Bureau of Investigation already has the hard drives. The evidence is untouchable, and your entire life is completely over." Beatrice stared at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of all the power and prestige she had wielded like a weapon for 3 decades. She had spent her entire life trying to prove she was better than everyone else, and now she was standing in a ruined boardroom facing the total collapse of her fake empire. My father, who had been sitting silently in the corner this entire time, finally stood up. He looked at Beatrice with an expression of profound emptiness. "You drained my retirement," my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I worked for 40 years to build that safety net, and you gave it all to a criminal just so Chantel could carry designer bags. I have absolutely nothing left because of your vanity." "I did it for the family legacy," Beatrice cried out desperately, trying to find a way to justify her horrifying betrayal. "I wanted us to be the most respected family in the city." "There is no legacy left," Beatrice, my father replied, turning away from her and walking slowly toward the boardroom doors. "I am filing for divorce the moment I leave this building. I am done letting you destroy my life to feed your ego." He walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Beatrice standing alone in the center of the wreckage. Chantel was still sobbing on the floor, unable to process the destruction of her perfect fake life. Preston sat trembling in the corner, knowing he was going to spend the next decade behind bars. The 3 bank directors who had remained silent during the emotional implosion of my family stepped forward. The lead director, the tall, imposing man with silver hair, looked at Beatrice with absolute, undisguised disgust. He buttoned his suit jacket and picked up his leather satchel. "By the way," Beatrice, the lead director, said, his voice echoing with devastating finality, "to cover the massive failing margins of Preston, over the last 6 months, your primary residence was quietly put up as collateral. Since Preston has officially defaulted on those loans, and the FBI has frozen all associated assets, the bank is legally required to collect on that collateral immediately." The director paused, letting the full weight of his words settle over the room before delivering the final crushing blow. "The bank is initiating full foreclosure proceedings on your mansion tomorrow morning. You have 30 days to vacate the premises before the federal marshals arrive to seize the property." Beatrice collapsed heavily into one of the leather boardroom chairs, gasping for air as her lungs completely seized up in pure panic. She clutched her chest, her eyes rolling back slightly as the realization hit her. Her husband had just left her. Her golden child was married to a broke criminal. Her elite country club friends would disown her by dinner time. And now the massive suburban mansion she had used to look down on me for years was being taken away by the bank. Her empire was burning to the ground, leaving nothing but ash and humiliation. I stood there watching the woman who had tormented me for 32 years, finally facing the absolute consequences of her own actions. She had spent my entire childhood telling me I was an embarrassment because I preferred quiet hard work over flashy social events. She had spent my entire adulthood trying to hide my success because it did not fit into her narrative of me being the family failure. And now she had nothing left but the shredded pieces of her own deceit scattered across the floor. Jamal gently placed his hand on my lower back, offering a silent anchor of support as we watched the scene unfold. The bank directors nodded respectfully to me and Jamal before turning their backs on Beatrice and exiting the boardroom. They had delivered the truth and their job was done. Preston finally found the courage to stand up from his corner, but he did not look at me or Jamal. He kept his eyes glued to the floor as he scurried out of the room like a terrified rat, desperate to find his defense attorneys before the federal agents tracked him down. Chantel remained on the floor crying so hard her body shook violently. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for the sympathy she had never once shown me. "You have to help us," Kiara Chantel pleaded, her voice hoarse and broken. "You have $40 million in that trust. You can pay off the bank. You can save the house. You are my sister. You cannot just leave us with nothing." I looked down at Chantel and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no obligation. "You chose your path." "Chantel," I said calmly. "You stood by and laughed while Preston mocked my husband. You cheered when Mom tried to ruin my wedding. You enjoyed the luxury that was bought with stolen money, and now you have to pay the bill." I turned to leave, but Beatrice suddenly reached out, grabbing the hem of my jacket. Her grip was weak, her fingers trembling. "Kiara, please," Beatrice whispered, her voice devoid of its usual arrogant sting. "I am your mother." I pulled my jacket firmly from her grasp, stepping away from the toxic woman who had tried to break my spirit. "You stopped being my mother the day you chose status over love," I replied. "Enjoy the consequences of your legacy, Beatrice, because it is the only thing you have left." Jamal took my hand and we walked out of the frosted glass doors, leaving them to choke on the ashes of their ruined empire. The days following the absolute destruction in the corporate boardroom should have been a time for reflection and deep remorse for any normal person. But my mother Beatrice was not a normal person. Her entire psychological foundation was built on the desperate need for external validation and elite social status. Instead of accepting the harsh reality that her husband had finally left her, and her massive suburban mansion was facing imminent foreclosure, she doubled down on her delusions. She convinced herself that if she could just force me into a tight corner in front of the right people, I would cave to the immense pressure and hand over the $40 million blind trust of Grandpa Silas to save the family name from public disgrace. She needed to throw one last massive, extravagant event to prove to the entire city that the swirling rumors of her bankruptcy were completely false. But the banks had frozen all of her accounts. Her credit cards were completely useless pieces of plastic. Chantel and Preston were bleeding cash, just trying to keep federal investigators at bay and avoid immediate arrest. So Beatrice did the most reckless and desperate thing a person in her highly precarious position could possibly do. She walked into the shady, unkempt office of a predatory high-interest payday loan shark operating on the industrial outskirts of the city. She used her last remaining shreds of social leverage and a barrage of fabricated financial documents to secure a massive short-term cash loan with an astronomical interest rate that would financially ruin her for the rest of her natural life, regardless of the outcome. She took that dirty cash, stuffed it into her designer handbag, and marched straight to the most exclusive country club in the city to book their grand ballroom for the upcoming Saturday night. She called it the Silas Family Legacy Gala. She hired premium catering services, live string quartets, and elite floral designers to mask the overwhelming stench of her own desperation. Then she began making the phone calls. She personally invited the absolute upper echelon of the black elite in the city. She called local politicians, prominent pastors, wealthy business owners, and influential charity board directors. And of course, she sent mandatory physical invitations to the 47 relatives who had completely boycotted my wedding. She told them this elaborate gala was a surprise celebration of family unity and that I was going to make a massive philanthropic announcement that would change the trajectory of our family history forever. Her master plan was incredibly transparent to anyone who knew the truth, but undeniably dangerous in its execution. She intended to physically trap me in a room filled with the most powerful people in the state. She was going to confidently take the stage and publicly announce that I was generously donating the entire blind trust to a brand new charitable foundation. What she would conveniently leave out of this grand speech was that this new fake foundation would be completely controlled by Preston and Chantel, giving them total unrestricted access to the money they desperately needed to pay off their federal debts and avoid prison time. Beatrice was betting everything she had left on the assumption that I would be too embarrassed and too intimidated to cause a massive public scene in front of the high society elites she so deeply worshipped. She thought my deeply ingrained fear of social humiliation would force me to smile, nod, and sign away my empire just to keep the peace and protect the family image. She severely underestimated the strong, powerful woman I had become over the years. When the heavy gold foil invitation arrived at my luxury penthouse apartment, Jamal and I did not panic. We did not feel intimidated or scared. We actually sat on our sofa and laughed out loud at her sheer audacity. Jamal poured us 2 glasses of sparkling water, and we sat on our private balcony, looking out over the glittering city lights, planning exactly how we were going to end this toxic cycle once and for all. We knew Preston was getting incredibly desperate. The federal subpoena was hanging heavily over his head, and his criminal defense lawyers were demanding exorbitant retainer fees he simply could not afford to pay. Chantel was spiraling into total denial, posting old luxurious vacation photos on her social media accounts to pretend her perfect life was still intact. And Beatrice was busy organizing her own public execution without even realizing the trap she was setting for herself. When Saturday evening finally arrived, Jamal and I dressed for absolute war. I wore a breathtaking floor-length emerald green gown that fit me perfectly, radiating a quiet, untouchable confidence that required no external validation. My hair was styled immaculately, and my jewelry was subtle but undeniably expensive, reflecting true wealth rather than loud desperation. Jamal wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that perfectly highlighted his broad shoulders and commanding physical presence. We looked like absolute royalty stepping out of a magazine. We stepped into the back of our chauffeured town car and headed toward the exclusive country club, ready to completely dismantle the final pathetic illusion of my manipulative mother. We arrived at the country club just as the main cocktail hour was reaching its peak volume. The grand ballroom was an opulent display of excessive, unnecessary spending. Towering centerpieces of expensive white orchids sat on every single table, and massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the hundreds of distinguished guests mingling below. As Jamal and I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the grand entrance, the dynamic of the room shifted immediately. The 47 relatives who had purposely ignored my wedding were clustered together near the open bar, looking highly confused and anxious by the swirling rumors they had been hearing all week. They had heard quiet whispers about the city police showing up at the family cookout and the sudden, unexplained disappearance of my father. But Beatrice had aggressively assured them tonight would clear everything up and restore the family honor. When they saw me walk in looking more successful and genuinely powerful than anyone else in the entire room, their expressions rapidly shifted from arrogant judgment to profound uncertainty. The elite bank directors and federal judges who had attended my wedding were also there, standing together in a quiet, powerful group near the front of the stage. They nodded respectfully to me and Jamal as we entered, their silent, unshakable support serving as a solid protective shield against the toxic energy of my family. Beatrice was standing near the center of the room, wearing a heavily beaded gown she absolutely could not afford. She spotted me immediately, and her eyes flashed with a potent mixture of triumphant malice and deep-seated anxiety. She really thought her desperate trap was going to work. She thought she had finally cornered the scapegoat daughter in front of the entire city. Preston and Chantel were hovering nervously near the edge of the stage, trying to look confident. Preston looked physically ill, sweating heavily through his expensive designer suit jacket as he constantly checked his phone for urgent updates from his defense attorneys. Chantel was drinking champagne far too quickly, trying desperately to numb the terrifying reality of her impending crushing poverty. Suddenly, Beatrice grabbed a silver spoon and began aggressively tapping it against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut cleanly through the low hum of conversation, demanding the absolute undivided attention of every single guest in the massive ballroom. The background music faded away into silence, and all eyes turned toward my mother as she stepped confidently up to the main microphone standing on the beautifully decorated stage. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and heavily practiced charm. "We are gathered here this evening to celebrate the enduring beautiful legacy of my late father Silas and the incredible prosperous future of this family." She paused, wiping a completely fake theatrical tear from her eye as she looked out over the attentive crowd. She was playing the role of the benevolent, loving matriarch, perfectly hoping to deceive everyone in the room. "Tonight is a very special night indeed," Beatrice continued, her voice rising with dramatic emotional flair. "My beautiful, talented daughter Kiara has decided to honor our family name in the most spectacular, generous way possible. She is going to come up here right now and officially announce the donation of her entire trust fund to the brand new Silas Heritage Foundation, which will be managed directly by my brilliant son-in-law Preston and my wonderful daughter Chantel." The ballroom erupted into loud, polite applause from the wealthy guests, who did not know the dark, twisted truth hiding beneath the surface. The 47 relatives clapped hesitantly, their hands moving slowly as they tried to understand the bizarre, contradictory family dynamics playing out in front of them. Beatrice looked directly down at me from the stage, her smile wide and predatory, practically daring me to ruin the moment. "Come on up here, Kiara," Beatrice called out loudly, gesturing grandly for me to join her in the spotlight. "Do not be shy, darling. Come and tell everyone about your incredibly generous gift to the family legacy." She thought I would freeze in terror. She firmly believed that the immense crushing pressure of hundreds of elite judging eyes staring at me would completely break my resolve and force me to comply with her demands. But I did not hesitate for a single second. I released the strong, warm hand of Jamal and walked gracefully through the parted crowd, my head held extremely high. My emerald gown flowed elegantly behind me, sweeping the floor as I ascended the short wooden staircase leading up to the stage. I walked right up to the spot where my mother was standing, maintaining unwavering, piercing eye contact the entire time. Her smug, arrogant smile faltered slightly as I got closer, realizing much too late that my hands were not shaking and I was not afraid of her anymore. I reached out deliberately and smoothly took the microphone right out of her trembling hand, leaving her standing there frozen with empty fingers clutching nothing but air. I turned my back on her to face the massive crowd, looking out at the expectant faces of the politicians, the business leaders, the 47 anxious relatives, and the utterly terrified expressions of Preston and Chantel cowering near the stairs. The enormous room was so incredibly quiet, you could hear a pin drop on the carpeted floor. "My mother wants to talk to all of you tonight about family legacy," I said, my voice perfectly calm, powerful, and echoing clearly through the silent grand ballroom. "So let us take a moment to look at exactly what my mother and my brother-in-law have been building behind closed doors with the legacy of my grandfather." I did not bother to look back at Beatrice as she stood paralyzed behind me. I simply raised my hand in the air and signaled directly to the audio-visual booth, located at the very back of the room. The main ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed slightly, casting shadows over the bewildered faces of the elite guests. A massive high-definition projector screen began to lower slowly and mechanically from the ceiling, dropping down directly behind the stage. Preston realized exactly what was happening the moment the gears began to grind. His face went completely stark white, drained of all color and arrogant pride. He jumped up from his table, acting like a madman, screaming frantically at the top of his lungs to cut the power to the building before the first damning image even appeared on the glowing white screen. He knew deep down that his entire fake life of stolen luxury and fraudulent privilege was about to be permanently destroyed right now. The frantic screams of Preston echoed through the massive grand ballroom, cutting through the elegant atmosphere like a jagged knife. He was jumping over the beautifully decorated tables, knocking over expensive crystal centerpieces, and spilling vintage champagne across the laps of the terrified high society guests. "Cut the power to the building!" he bellowed, his face completely pale and slick with the cold sweat of a man who knew his entire fraudulent existence was about to be broadcast to the world. He scrambled toward the back of the room, desperately trying to reach the audio-visual booth, but the sheer density of the crowd and the sheer panic blinding his vision slowed him down completely. On the stage, my mother Beatrice realized that the carefully constructed trap she had set for me had just violently snapped shut on her own neck. The heavy projector screen continued its slow mechanical descent, dropping down behind me like an executioner raising his blade. Beatrice lunged forward, her beaded gown catching on the microphone stand as she frantically dropped to her knees. She began clawing at the thick black cables, twisting and pulling with desperate, unhinged energy, trying to manually disconnect the entire sound system from the main power source. Her perfect manicured nails chipped and broke against the heavy rubber cords, but she did not stop tearing at them. She quickly realized she could not pull the cables loose, so she immediately reverted to the only defensive weapon she had left, which was performative victimhood. Beatrice scrambled back to her feet and turned to face the hundreds of confused elite guests. She forced large, dramatic tears to spill from her eyes, pressing her hands to her chest in a display of ultimate fake maternal agony. "Please forgive this terrible interruption," Beatrice cried out, her voice shaking with manufactured sorrow. "My daughter Kiara is suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She has been deeply unwell for years, and the stress of her failed business ventures has completely shattered her mind. Someone please call for medical assistance and help me get my sick daughter off this stage before she embarrasses herself any further." The wealthy politicians and charity board directors in the front rows murmured among themselves, unsure of how to react to the chaotic scene. The 47 relatives who had been lied to for weeks leaned forward in their seats, their faces twisted in confusion as they watched my mother desperately try to silence me. They wanted to believe the narrative of the caring, worried mother, but the absolute terror radiating from Beatrice and the unhinged screaming of Preston in the background told a completely different story. I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still in my emerald green gown, holding the microphone with a steady, unshakable grip. I looked down at my mother as she wept her fake tears, and I felt absolutely no pity. "It is far too late for your lies, Beatrice," I said, my voice calm and projecting clearly over the rising panic in the room. "The truth does not need a power cord." I had anticipated her attempts to sabotage the presentation. I had not handed a simple flash drive to a random technician in the back booth. Jamal and I had hired an elite private security firm to manage the audio-visual feeds for the entire evening. They were operating on an independent encrypted system that Beatrice and Preston could not possibly reach or disconnect. The massive screen behind me suddenly flashed to life, illuminating the entire grand ballroom with a stark, bright white light. The high-definition video began to play immediately, the crisp resolution leaving absolutely no room for denial or misinterpretation. The footage had been captured by top-tier private investigators that Jamal had hired weeks ago to track the movements and financial transactions of my arrogant brother-in-law. The video showed Preston standing inside the showroom of the most exclusive luxury car dealership in the city. He was leaning casually against the sleek hood of a brand-new $150,000 Porsche, laughing confidently with the sales manager. But Preston was not alone. Hanging off his arm, looking adoringly into his eyes, was a young blonde white woman who was very clearly not my sister Chantel. She was his secret mistress, a woman he had been hiding in a luxury downtown apartment for the past 2 years, while playing the devoted wealthy husband to my gullible sister. The ballroom gasped in collective shock. The sound of hundreds of elite guests drawing in their breath all at once sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Chantel, who had been standing frozen near the edge of the stage, let out a strangled, horrifying sound. Her knees buckled slightly as she stared up at the massive screen, watching the husband she worshipped kissing another woman on the cheek and handing her the keys to a luxury sports car. But the infidelity was not even the most devastating part of the video. The private investigators had managed to secure a direct zoomed-in shot of the financial documents Preston was signing at the dealership desk. The high-definition camera focused clearly on the bank transfer authorization forms. The routing numbers and account details were displayed in massive black text for every single judge, banker, and relative in the room to see. "Those are not the account numbers of a successful finance broker," I announced, my voice cutting through the shocked murmurs of the crowd. Those are the exact routing numbers from the personal retirement accounts of my father. Preston did not use his own wealth to buy a sports car for his mistress. He used the life savings of my father, the money that Beatrice willingly handed over to him to fund his fraudulent lifestyle. The entire room erupted in outraged whispers. The prominent bank executives who had attended my wedding shook their heads in profound disgust, recognizing the blatant financial crime being broadcast right in front of them. The politician who had gladly accepted campaign donations from Beatrice suddenly looked completely horrified, realizing the money they took was stolen from a drained retirement fund. The perfect wealthy image my mother had spent 30 years cultivating was disintegrating into a pile of pathetic, humiliating ash. Beatrice stood frozen on the stage, her fake tears drying instantly on her cheeks. She looked back at the screen, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. She had given everything to Preston. She had sacrificed the financial security of her own husband, betrayed her own blood, and compromised every moral principle she had just to ensure that Chantel had a wealthy white husband to show off at the country club. And now the entire city was watching that very same husband use her stolen money to spoil a white mistress. Preston had finally stopped running toward the back booth. He stood paralyzed in the middle of the dining floor, staring up at the screen as his entire world completely collapsed. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified expression of a man who knew he was going to federal prison. But the presentation was not over. The video of the car dealership faded to black, and the screen transitioned to a simple audio waveform graphic. The private investigators had legally obtained access to the cellular cloud backups of Preston while investigating his extensive wire fraud. They had found a treasure trove of deleted voicemails, revealing the true depth of the malicious conspiracy between him and my mother. This next piece of evidence requires no introduction, I stated calmly, looking directly at the 47 relatives sitting near the front tables. I want all of you to listen very closely to how much the matriarch of this family truly values your loyalty and your love. The audio file began to play, echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers of the ballroom. The sharp, unmistakable voice of my mother, Beatrice, filled the silent room. The voicemail had been left for Preston exactly 1 year ago, right around the time he had first started draining the accounts of my father. Just forge the signature of Silas and take the money. Preston, the recorded voice of Beatrice snapped, her tone dripping with toxic impatience and greed. Nobody is going to check the blind trust documents. Kiara is a complete failure anyway. She plays in the dirt and refuses to elevate herself. She does not need a massive inheritance because she would not even know how to spend it properly. Just take the cash and transfer it to your accounts. I need the husband of Chantel to look richer and more successful than the pathetic kids of my sister. Those people are so jealous of us, and I will not let them see us struggle. Just take the money so we can keep up appearances. The silence that followed the end of the voicemail was the most heavy, suffocating silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. The sheer absolute betrayal contained in that short audio clip was staggering. Beatrice had not just admitted to orchestrating massive federal bank fraud and forging the legal documents of her own deceased father. She had openly admitted to actively destroying my future simply because she wanted to win a petty imaginary competition against her own sister. The 47 relatives who had blindly followed her orders, who had skipped my wedding because they believed her lies about me being an embarrassment, sat completely frozen in their seats. The aunts and uncles who had judged me at the family cookout were now staring at Beatrice with expressions of pure, unfiltered hatred. They had just heard her call their own children pathetic. They had just heard her admit that she viewed them all as nothing more than an audience for her fake superior wealth. The collective gasp of the high society elites rippled through the room, turning rapidly into loud, angry shouts of disgust. The federal judges and local politicians immediately began standing up from their tables, grabbing their coats and signaling to their spouses that it was time to leave. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family that was actively involved in federal embezzlement and public fraud. The social execution of my mother was absolute and irreversible. "How could you do this?" an aunt screamed from the crowd, pointing a furious finger at Beatrice. You lied to all of us. You told us Kiara was crazy. You stole from your own father to impress these people. The relatives erupted in fury, pushing their chairs back and marching toward the stage, demanding answers. Beatrice backed away from the edge of the stage, her hands trembling wildly as she looked at the angry mob of family members she could no longer control or manipulate. She had lost her power, she had lost her money, and now she had completely lost the respect of every single person in her life. But the most explosive reaction did not come from the relatives or the elite guests. It came from Chantel. My golden child sister had spent her entire existence believing she was better than me, because she had a rich husband and the unconditional support of our mother. In the span of 5 minutes, she had discovered that her husband was a cheating fraud. Her wealth was stolen from our father, and her mother was a criminal who had orchestrated the entire pathetic charade. Chantel let out a piercing, guttural scream that silenced the angry shouts of the relatives. She grabbed a full glass of red wine from the nearest table and marched directly toward Preston, who was still standing frozen in the middle of the ballroom. Preston saw her coming and raised his hands defensively, his eyes wide with fear. "You ruined my life!" Chantal shrieked, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You promised me a perfect life, and you used my family money to buy cars for some cheap blonde girl. You are disgusting." Chantel threw the heavy crystal glass directly at the face of Preston. The glass shattered against his shoulder, sending dark red wine splashing across the crisp white collar of his expensive dress shirt. Preston stumbled backward, his hands coming up to shield his face from the shards of broken crystal. The crowd gasped, stepping back to avoid the domestic violence erupting in the center of the elegant room. Preston wiped the wine from his face, his panicked expression suddenly twisting into a mask of aggressive, volatile rage. The polite, wealthy finance broker persona vanished entirely, revealing the desperate, cornered coward he truly was. "Get away from me, you crazy psycho!" Preston roared, shoving Chantel aggressively backward. He pushed her so hard that her high heels slipped on the polished floor, sending her crashing down onto the carpet in a tangle of expensive fabric and shattered pride. Preston did not stop to see if his wife was hurt. He did not care about Chantel or Beatrice or the family legacy. He only cared about saving his own skin from the federal investigators he knew were closing in on him. He looked frantically around the ballroom, realizing that the main exit doors were completely blocked by the angry crowd of relatives and distinguished guests who were watching the scene unfold with utter contempt. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the heavy wooden service doors that led directly into the bustling commercial kitchens of the country club. It was his only chance to escape the humiliation and the impending legal consequences of his actions. Preston shoved a passing waiter out of his way, sending a tray of appetizers clattering to the floor, and sprinted with desperate, frantic speed straight toward the kitchen service doors, determined to completely disappear into the dark alley behind the building before the authorities could arrive to collect their bounty. The heavy wooden service doors swung shut behind Preston as he fled, leaving the grand ballroom in a state of absolute, unprecedented uproar. The massive high-definition screen behind the stage had finally gone black, but the damning evidence it had just broadcast was permanently burned into the minds of every single person in the room. The wealthy elite guests were practically sprinting toward the main exits, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic radioactive fallout of my mother. But the 47 relatives who had been seated near the front did not leave. They did not run away. Instead, they rose from their chairs as one massive, unified collective and began to slowly, methodically surround the stage where Beatrice was standing. The sheer volume of their combined anger was suffocating. These were proud, hardworking people who valued family loyalty above everything else, and they had just been forced to listen to a voicemail of my mother calling them pathetic and actively plotting to steal from my grandfather just to look down on them. Uncle Marcus led the charge, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face were twitching. He stepped right up to the edge of the stage, looking up at the woman who had manipulated them all for decades. "How could you do this, Beatrice?" Uncle Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with a potent mix of profound disappointment and furious rage. "You called every single one of us 2 days before the wedding. You sat on the phone and cried real tears telling us that Kiara had completely lost her mind. You swore to us that she was running a dangerous illegal scam, and that if we showed up to support her, the federal authorities would arrest us too. You terrified your own sisters and brothers into abandoning our niece on the most important day of her life. Aunt Sarah stepped up right next to him, tears of intense frustration streaming down her face. You told us we were protecting her by staying away, Aunt Sarah yelled, pointing an accusing finger at my mother. You said she needed tough love to hit rock bottom so she would come back to the family. But you were just trying to isolate her so you could steal the money of our father. You looked me right in the eye at the family cookout and acted like you were the victim. You called my children pathetic. You drained the retirement accounts of your own husband to buy luxury cars for a cheating white fraud. Beatrice backed away from the edge of the stage, her hands trembling wildly as she looked down at the angry mob of family members she could no longer control. The perfectly crafted illusion of the benevolent, wealthy matriarch was completely shattered, leaving nothing behind but a desperate, greedy coward. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She looked frantically around the empty tables, hoping to find a single sympathetic face, but there was absolutely no one left to defend her. The elite judges and bank executives had already exited the building, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a family involved in federal embezzlement. It was not my fault, Beatrice cried out, her voice shrill and defensive as she instinctively tried to shift the blame to save herself. Preston manipulated me. He told me the investments were guaranteed to double our money. He said Silas would have wanted the funds to grow. He tricked me into signing those transfers. I was just trying to secure the financial future of this family. You have to believe me. He lied to all of us. Do not you dare blame this entirely on him. Uncle Marcus roared, his deep voice echoing through the massive empty reception hall. We all heard the voicemail, Beatrice. We heard your exact words. You told him to forge the signature. You told him that Kiara was a failure who did not deserve her inheritance. You orchestrated this entire despicable nightmare because you were so obsessed with looking richer than the rest of us. You sold your own soul to a country club membership, and you sacrificed your own daughter to do it. You are a disgrace to the legacy of our father. The relatives began shouting over each other, demanding answers, throwing every single lie she had ever told right back in her face. Beatrice covered her ears with her shaking hands, cowering on the stage as the weight of 30 years of toxic manipulation finally crashed down on her shoulders. She had spent her entire life trying to be the most important person in every room, and now she was the most despised woman in the entire city. But the most explosive reaction did not come from the furious aunts and uncles surrounding the stage. It came from the floor right next to my feet. My golden child sister Chantel was still lying on the carpet where Preston had violently shoved her. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air as her chest heaved with uncontrollable panicked sobs. Her heavy beaded designer gown was soaked in the red wine she had tried to throw at her husband, and her expensive makeup was running down her face in dark, messy streaks. In the span of 15 minutes, Chantel had discovered that her entire reality was a complete and utter lie. The wealthy white husband she worshipped and used to make herself feel superior was completely broke and facing federal prison time. The luxury penthouse she lived in was secretly owned by the sister she had mocked her entire life. The designer bags she carried and the exotic vacations she bragged about were all funded by money stolen from our father and Grandpa Silas. And the ultimate crushing blow was watching her husband kissing a blonde white mistress on a massive high-definition screen in front of hundreds of people. Her fake luxury life was permanently, totally destroyed. Chantel crawled across the polished hardwood floor, her wine-soaked dress dragging heavily behind her. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my emerald green gown, clutching the fabric with desperate tight fingers. She looked up at me, her face twisted in a mask of pure terror and pathetic victimhood. The arrogant, cruel sister who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck was now kneeling at my feet, begging for salvation. Kiara, please, you have to help me. Chantel sobbed hysterically, her voice cracking as she choked on her own tears. You have to fix this. Preston is going to go to jail. The bank is going to take my penthouse. All of my friends are going to find out that I am broke. You have $40 million in that blind trust. You can hire the best defense lawyers in the country. You can pay off the bank and make all of this go away. Please, Kiara, you are my big sister. You are supposed to protect me. You have to fix this massive mess. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the sobbing, pathetic woman clinging to the bottom of my dress. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I did not feel the familiar heavy guilt that my mother had spent decades conditioning me to feel whenever Chantel was upset. The invisible toxic chains that had bound me to this family for 32 years had been completely severed. I looked at my sister and I saw exactly what she was: a selfish, cruel enabler who had gladly feasted on my pain to feed her own vanity. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my dress out of her desperate, grasping hands. I took a deliberate step backward, putting physical and emotional distance between us. I looked down into the terrified, tear-filled eyes of my sister, and I delivered the cold, hard, absolute truth. I am not fixing anything for you, Chantel. I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. You watched them tear me down for 32 years. You sat at every family dinner and giggled while Mom called me a failure. You wore designer clothes bought with the retirement money of our father, and you never once questioned where the cash came from because you did not care. You were perfectly happy to let me be the scapegoat as long as you got to wear a crown bought with stolen money. You actively plotted with Mom to steal the inheritance of our grandfather, knowing it belonged to me. You made your choices, Chantel, and now you get to live with the consequences of them. I am not your savior. I am not your safety net. And I am certainly not fixing your pathetic mess. Chantel let out a piercing, devastating wail, covering her face with her hands as she collapsed fully onto the floor. The reality of her total, permanent isolation finally hit her. She had alienated this only person who actually had the power to save her, and she had done it simply because she enjoyed being cruel. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing on the floor as the 47 relatives continued to loudly interrogate my mother on the stage. My part in this ballroom was completely finished. Justice had been fully served to the women who had tormented me. But there was still one more piece of trash that needed to be taken out tonight. Meanwhile, at the very back of the luxury country club, Preston was sprinting frantically through the maze of the commercial kitchen. He was knocking over metal prep tables and shoving startled culinary staff out of his way as he desperately searched for the rear exit. His expensive suit was stained with red wine and sweat, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He knew the federal investigators had all the evidence they needed, and he knew that if he did not get out of this building right now, he would be spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. He saw the heavy metal double doors with the glowing red exit sign above them. He lowered his shoulder and hit the push bar with all of his remaining strength, kicking the back exit doors open and bursting out into the cool night air of the service alley. He stumbled down the concrete loading dock, expecting to find an empty street where he could run into the shadows and hail a cab to the airport to flee the state before the authorities could freeze his remaining hidden accounts. But the service alley was not empty. Standing right at the bottom of the concrete stairs, leaning casually against the cold brick wall of the country club, was Jamal. My husband had slipped out of the ballroom the moment Preston made his run for the kitchen, knowing exactly where the cowardly finance broker would try to escape. Jamal stood there looking incredibly calm and powerful in his midnight blue tuxedo, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The dim yellow glow of the street lamp illuminated the quiet, knowing smile on his face. But Jamal was not standing in the alley alone. Flanking my husband on either side were three tall, imposing men wearing dark weather-resistant windbreakers. The bold yellow letters printed across the back and front of their jackets clearly identified them as agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They stood in a tactical semicircle blocking the exit route of the alleyway. The lead agent stepped forward, reaching into his inner jacket pocket and pulling out a thick folded stack of official federal warrants. Preston froze at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide with absolute horror, as the cold reality of his permanent destruction finally surrounded him completely, leaving him with absolutely no way out of the darkness and ensuring that he would finally pay the ultimate and unforgiving price. Meanwhile, back inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted from chaotic outrage to a cold, highly organized lockdown. Several uniformed city police officers had already arrived on the scene, moving quickly to secure the exits and prevent any further physical altercations among the completely devastated guests, who remained scattered around the room right now. I was standing near the center of the dance floor watching as the final remnants of the fake empire of my mother collapsed into utter ruin. Beatrice was completely surrounded by the highly influential senior members of the country club board of directors. These were the incredibly wealthy elite women she had spent decades trying to impress, the women she had drained the retirement accounts of her own husband to appease. They were looking at her with expressions of profound, unmistakable disgust, as if she were a piece of garbage that had somehow blown into their pristine dining hall tonight. The president of the country club board, a severe-looking woman wearing an expensive pearl necklace, stepped forward and crossed her arms. "Beatrice, you have completely disgraced the prestigious reputation of this institution," the board president stated, her voice echoing with cold, harsh finality. "You invited us here under false pretenses involving stolen funds and federal embezzlement. You are officially stripped of your membership effective immediately. Your name will be permanently erased from all of our charity committees and social registries. You are to clear out your private locker by tomorrow morning and never return to this elite property again." My mother gasped, clutching her chest as she absorbed the ultimate social execution she had always feared the most. She had lost her membership, her status, and her entire fake identity in a single devastating moment. She looked around the room, frantically hoping anyone would step forward to defend her honor, but she found absolutely zero sympathy. Her eyes landed on the 47 relatives who had gathered together in a large unified group near the main entrance of the ballroom. Uncle Marcus and Aunt Sarah stood at the front of the group, their expressions completely stony and resolute. "We are completely done with you, Beatrice," Uncle Marcus announced, his deep voice carrying across the quiet room so every single person could hear his verdict. "You lied to your own blood to isolate your daughter. You tried to steal the sacred legacy of our father to fund a criminal lifestyle for your spoiled daughter and her racist, fraudulent husband. You are no longer a part of this family. We officially disown you right here and right now. Do not ever call us or reach out to us again. You have entirely poisoned this family tree for the last time." The 47 relatives turned their backs on my mother in perfect unison, entirely rejecting her toxic manipulation and greedy narcissism. They walked away from her, pulling their coats around their shoulders, and began moving across the ballroom floor to join me and Jamal. They formed a warm, protective circle around us, offering quiet, sincere apologies for ever doubting my character and believing the horrific lies my mother had spread. Their presence felt incredibly validating, proving that the true legacy of our grandfather was built on authentic love and mutual respect, rather than the fake, superficial status of Beatrice today. My father, who had been standing silently near the edge of the stage, finally made his move. He did not shout or cause a dramatic scene. He simply walked over to the table where his coat was resting, picked it up, and walked directly past my mother without even looking at her face. Beatrice reached out a trembling hand, trying to grab his sleeve to beg him to stay, but he smoothly pulled his arm away from her desperate grasp. He walked out of the grand ballroom doors, leaving his toxic, manipulative wife entirely alone in her devastating ruin forever. Beatrice was completely abandoned by every single person she had ever known. Her friends had stripped her of her elite status. Her family had officially disowned her, and her husband had finally walked out on her for good. The massive, heavy reality of her total, permanent isolation crashed down upon her shoulders, causing her knees to buckle beneath her beaded designer gown. She collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, right in front of where I was standing with Jamal. The arrogant, cruel matriarch who had tormented me for 32 years was now reduced to a sobbing mess today. She dropped completely to her knees, her hands pressed flat against the carpet as she looked up at me with tears ruining her expensive makeup. "Please, Kiara," Beatrice begged, her voice hoarse and pathetic as she choked on her own desperate sobs. "You have to help us. They are taking the house tomorrow morning. The bank is going to lock the doors and throw all of our belongings into the street. The luxury penthouse of Chantel is being foreclosed on, and she has absolutely nothing left. We are completely bankrupt and completely ruined. You have to save your mother now." Please give us some of the money from the blind trust of your grandfather. Beatrice pleaded, her hands shaking violently as she reached toward the hem of my emerald green gown. You have $40 million, Kiara. You can spare enough to save our homes and keep us off the streets. We have nowhere else to live and nowhere else to go. You cannot just leave your mother and your sister to become homeless. Please, Kiara, I am begging you to show some mercy to your own family. She stayed on her knees, weeping loudly as her fake empire burned. The grand ballroom was a graveyard of shattered illusions. The beautiful space felt completely hollow, stripped of the artificial prestige my mother had spent her entire life worshipping. The 47 relatives had already turned their backs and walked away, disgusted by the toxic lies they uncovered. My father was gone, having finally found the courage to permanently walk out on a marriage built on manipulation. Outside in the cold, damp service alley, Preston sat in the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, his wrists bound in heavy handcuffs, his elite facade completely destroyed by the federal agents preparing to transport him to a holding cell. Inside the silent hall, there were only 3 people left standing near the center of the hardwood floor. There was me standing tall and secure in my emerald green gown with Jamal, a steady, unshakable mountain of support by my side. And then there was my mother Beatrice kneeling on the carpet in her ruined beaded dress surrounded by the wreckage of her own catastrophic choices. Chantel was still curled into a pathetic ball nearby, trembling uncontrollably in her wine-soaked gown, completely unable to process the total annihilation of her fake wealthy lifestyle. Beatrice looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and frantic. She had just watched every single pillar of her existence collapse into dust. But her deeply ingrained toxic narcissism refused to let her accept defeat. She genuinely believed she could manipulate her way out of this nightmare, using the same emotional abuse she had used to control me since childhood. Please, Kiara. Beatrice begged, her voice hoarse and raw as she crawled closer to where I was standing. You have to save us. You are the only one who has the power to fix this. They are going to take my house tomorrow morning. The bank is going to lock the doors and throw our belongings into the street. You cannot just leave your mother to become homeless. Beatrice reached out her trembling fingers, hovering inches from the hem of my dress, but she did not dare touch me. She knew the power dynamic had completely shifted, and she was absolutely terrified of the consequences. She took a ragged breath and switched her tactic, moving from pathetic begging to aggressive, emotional blackmail. This is what she always did when she was backed into a corner. You owe me, Beatrice cried out, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to force tears that simply would not come. I gave you life, Kiara. I brought you into this world, and I raised you. You will be cursed by God if you turn your back on your own flesh and blood. You cannot abandon your own mother and sister to live on the streets while you sit on a $40 million fortune. People will call you a monster. They will say you are a heartless, cruel daughter who left her family to rot in the gutter. You have to give us some of the money from the blind trust of your grandfather. It is your duty as a daughter to protect this family. I stared down at the woman who had tormented me, listening to her pathetic attempts at a guilt trip. She was completely devoid of any genuine remorse or accountability. She did not apologize for orchestrating federal fraud. She did not apologize for allowing my father to lose his entire life savings. She did not apologize for trying to ruin my wedding or calling me a failure in front of the city. She only cared about saving her own skin and maintaining her fake rich lifestyle. Before I could respond to the unhinged demands of my mother, Chantel pushed herself up from the floor. My golden child sister wiped her running mascara with the back of her trembling hand, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered entitlement. She had just found out that her husband was a cheating federal criminal and that her entire life was funded by stolen money, but somehow she still believed she was the ultimate victim in this situation. You are my big sister! Chantel shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the empty ballroom. You are supposed to fix things for me. Preston is going to prison because of you. You ruined my marriage by exposing him. You embarrassed me in front of all my elite friends. The least you can do to make up for sending my husband to jail is let us live in one of the luxury resorts you own. Chantel stumbled forward, her wine-soaked dress dragging across the floor as she began listing her demands with absolute zero shame. "I cannot live in some cheap apartment," Chantel demanded aggressively, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I need a massive suite with room service and a balcony. Mom and I can move into the penthouse of your resort tomorrow. You have plenty of room for us, and it will not cost you anything. You must take care of us, Kiara. You have more money than you could ever spend, so you need to support my lifestyle until I figure out what to do next. It is the absolute least you can do after you deliberately destroyed my perfect life tonight." I looked at Chantel. Chantel and I felt a cold, deep sense of finality settle into my bones. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was staggering. She genuinely believed that she was entitled to my wealth simply because she existed. She showed absolutely no remorse for participating in the plot to steal my inheritance, and she felt absolutely no guilt for the terrible way she had treated me our entire lives. She just wanted a free ride in a luxury hotel suite while her criminal husband rotted in a federal penitentiary. Jamal shifted his weight beside me, his jaw clenching as he listened to the absurd demands of my sister. He looked completely ready to verbally destroy her, but I placed my hand gently on his arm, signaling that I had this entirely under control. I did not need to yell or scream or argue with these toxic women. I had prepared for this exact moment, and I had saved my absolute best weapon for the very end of the night. I looked down at Chantel, and I delivered a cold, hard truth that shattered her remaining delusions into a million tiny pieces. "You watched them tear me down for 32 years, I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. "You sat back and laughed while they called me a failure. You were perfectly happy to step on my neck so you could wear a fake plastic crown bought with stolen money. I am not your safety net, Chantel. I am not going to let you live in my resort, and I am absolutely not fixing your pathetic mess." Chantel gasped, stepping back as if I had physically struck her across the face. Beatrice let out another loud, dramatic wail, pounding her fists against the floor in a final desperate display of performative misery. "You are a monster," Beatrice screamed, her voice hoarse and broken. "You are going to leave us with absolutely nothing. The bank is going to lock us out of our homes tomorrow morning, and we will have nowhere to go. You are leaving your own family to sleep on the dirty streets." I reached down into my elegant designer clutch, pulling out a thick, heavy sealed manila envelope. The thick premium paper felt solid and final in my hands. I held the envelope up so both Beatrice and Chantel could see it clearly under the bright glowing light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. "I did not just inherit the blind trust of Grandpa Silas," I said smoothly, my voice projecting a quiet, terrifying power across the silent room. "I have spent the last 2 weeks doing some very extensive research into the financial status of this family. I knew exactly how much debt Preston had accumulated, and I knew exactly how deeply underwater both of your properties really were." Beatrice stopped crying instantly, her eyes locking onto the manila envelope with a sudden intense look of pure, undeniable fear. Chantel stopped breathing entirely, her chest freezing as she stared at the documents in my hands. "The bank executives who were here tonight were incredibly helpful to me. Over the past few days, I continued taking a slow, deliberate step toward my mother and my sister. They informed me that the massive loans Preston took out using your properties as collateral were completely toxic and heavily defaulted. The bank was desperately looking to offload those bad debts to any interested buyer to clear their ledgers before the federal indictment officially dropped." I ripped the seal of the manila envelope open with a loud, sharp tearing sound that echoed through the quiet ballroom. I reached inside and pulled out 2 crisp legal documents printed on heavy official watermark paper. I held the documents out, looking dead into the terrified wide eyes of my mother. "So I bought the debt portfolios for both your massive suburban mansion and the luxury downtown penthouse of Chantel, directly from the bank. Yesterday afternoon, I announced, my tone perfectly flat and completely unyielding. I purchased the absolute full legal rights to your mortgages using a tiny fraction of the money Grandpa Silas left for me." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and totally suffocating. The reality of what I had just said crashed down on them like a massive concrete block, completely crushing whatever tiny fragments of hope they had left in their desperate, greedy souls. They were not just dealing with a faceless anonymous bank anymore. They were dealing directly with the daughter they had abused, neglected, and tormented for over 3 decades. "I am your new landlord," I stated clearly, staring deeply into the broken, terrified soul of my mother. I let the 2 heavy pieces of official legal paper slip from my fingers. They fluttered slowly through the air, catching the light of the chandeliers, before landing softly on the carpet, right in front of the knees of Beatrice and the designer shoes of Chantal. Beatrice stared down at the documents, her entire body shaking violently as she read the bold black text printed across the top of the pages. Chantal let out a quiet whimpering sound as she realized exactly what the papers were. "These are your official 30-day eviction notices," I told them, my voice ringing with absolute glorious finality. "You have exactly 1 month to pack up all of your fake designer clothes and your worthless country club memories and get completely off my properties. You will surrender the keys to my legal team, and you will leave the premises immediately." The 2 women looked up at me, their faces twisted in pure, horrific despair, as the absolute ultimate consequence of their toxic actions finally buried them completely. "Please, Kiara," Chantal begged weakly, her voice barely a whisper. "Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do now?" I looked down at them, feeling a profound, beautiful sense of peace settle over my entire being. "Do not worry," I replied, a cold, dismissive smile touching my lips. "I hear the folding chairs at the local shelter are perfectly suitable for people like you." Beatrice and Chantal erupted into loud, agonizing screams of pure devastation, begging and crying as their entire world ended. I did not listen to another word. I turned my back on their pathetic screams and wrapped my hand securely around the strong, warm hand of Jamal. We walked out of the grand ballroom together, leaving them alone in the wreckage, stepping out into the cool night air to begin our beautiful new life, completely free from their toxic poison, forever knowing that we had finally achieved the perfect, absolute justice that my incredible grandfather had originally intended for us all those long, hard, incredibly difficult years ago. 6 months had passed since the elegant grand ballroom became the site of the ultimate destruction of my mother and her fake empire. The heavy, suffocating dust of decades of manipulation had finally settled, leaving behind a profoundly peaceful silence in my life. The consequences of that explosive night had played out with absolute unyielding precision. Preston, the arrogant white finance broker who thought his privilege made him entirely untouchable, was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was officially serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and grand embezzlement. His expensive tailored suits and country club memberships were nothing but a distant, humiliating memory as he spent his days mopping cafeteria floors under the watchful eyes of federal guards. Beatrice and Chantal were living a nightmare of their own making after I legally evicted them from the sprawling suburban mansion and the luxury downtown penthouse. They had nowhere left to turn. Their elite, wealthy friends had completely blocked their numbers the moment the scandal hit the local news. They were now renting a cramped, deeply unpleasant 2-bedroom apartment on the absolute worst side of the city. The walls were paper thin, the plumbing constantly leaked, and the neighborhood was a far cry from the gated communities they once ruled with their toxic arrogance. Without the stolen money of my grandfather to fund their designer lifestyles, both women were forced to do something they had always viewed with pure, intense disgust. They had to actually work for a living. Beatrice was working as an entry-level cashier at a discount retail store, spending her days scanning cheap plastic items and enduring the rude complaints of angry customers. Chantal, the former golden child, who used to brag about her fake billionaire husband, was now folding clothes in the back room of a fast fashion outlet in a dying suburban mall. They were entirely permanently cut off from the high society black elite circles they had worshipped for 32 years. It was the morning of Thanksgiving when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown local number. Jamal was in the kitchen preparing the turkey, his deep, rich laughter filling our home as he joked with his brothers. I sat on the edge of the sofa and watched the unknown number flash across the bright screen. I did not answer it. I let it ring until it finally went to voicemail. A few seconds later, the notification icon popped up indicating a new audio message. I tapped the screen and pressed the speaker button, holding the phone in the quiet space of our living room. Kiara, please pick up the phone. The pathetic, trembling voice of Beatrice filtered through the small speaker. She was clearly calling from a cheap prepaid burner phone, since I had permanently blocked her real number 6 months ago. It is your mother, Kiara. Please, I am begging you. Chantel. And I have absolutely nothing for Thanksgiving today. The heating bill is due, and they are threatening to shut off the power tomorrow morning. We cannot afford a turkey. We cannot even afford groceries for the week. You have $40 million. Kiara, you have everything. Please just send us a few $1,000s, so your family does not freeze in the dark. I know you are still angry, but you cannot just leave us like this. Please call me back. I am so sorry. I listened to the entire voicemail from start to finish. I heard the desperate tremor in her voice, the manufactured tears, and the subtle, lingering entitlement that still believed she was owed my grandfather's money, simply because she gave birth to me. I looked at the bright digital screen of my phone. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel pity. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, beautiful sense of total liberation. I pressed the red delete button, permanently erasing her voice from my phone and my life. Then I went into my settings and completely blocked the burner number. The toxic cycle of emotional abuse, manipulation, and financial theft was completely severed, forever. I walked into the warm, bright kitchen, wrapped my arms around the strong waist of my husband, and smiled as we celebrated a holiday filled with genuine, authentic love. The true, beautiful resolution of this entire journey arrived just 2 weeks later, on a crisp, clear Tuesday morning. The massive commercial district that Preston had arrogantly threatened to bulldoze for luxury condos had been completely transformed under my strict supervision. We had officially completed the construction of the Silas Community Innovation Center, a spectacular multi-million-dollar incubator built specifically for young, aspiring African-American entrepreneurs. The sprawling brick and glass complex featured state-of-the-art technology labs, collaborative workspaces, and mentorship offices designed to uplift and protect the future business leaders of our community. This was the real vision my grandfather had always dreamed of building. He never wanted his wealth to be hoarded by greedy socialites or stolen by fraudulent outsiders. He wanted his money to build a powerful, lasting foundation for Black excellence. And I had made absolutely sure his dream became a permanent, untouchable reality. The grand opening ceremony of the Innovation Center was the most incredible moment of my professional and personal life. The street was blocked off, and a massive crowd had gathered to celebrate the revitalization of the historic neighborhood. I stood on the expansive rooftop terrace of the newly finished building, looking out over the thriving, restored community below. The crisp winter air felt incredibly fresh and clean against my skin. Jamal stood right by my side, his strong arm wrapped securely around my waist, pulling me close as we watched the crowd below. The 47 relatives who had once blindly followed the toxic lies of my mother were all standing on the rooftop terrace with us today. They had spent the last 6 months making genuine, sincere amends to me. They had called, they had visited, and they had profusely apologized for allowing Beatrice to manipulate them into abandoning me on my wedding day. Uncle Marcus and Aunt Sarah were standing near the edge of the terrace, cheering loudly and proudly, taking photos of the beautiful new building. They had finally seen the absolute truth, and they had chosen to align themselves with the genuine, hard-working side of the family. They had realized that true family loyalty was not about keeping toxic secrets, but about supporting the people who actually built and protected the community. Standing near the center of the rooftop terrace were the distinguished elders who had saved my wedding day. The powerful federal judges, the bank executives, and the esteemed fraternity brothers of my grandfather were all dressed in their impeccable dark suits and elegant winter coats. The lead bank director, the man with the silver hair who had delivered the final crushing blow to Beatrice in the boardroom, stepped forward, holding a crystal flute filled with expensive vintage champagne. He raised his glass high into the air, turning to look directly at me with an expression of profound, undeniable pride. To Kiara, the director announced, his deep voice carrying clearly across the quiet rooftop. You did not just inherit the wealth of Silas, you inherited his incredible strength, his sharp, brilliant mind, and his unwavering commitment to the people of this city. You faced down unimaginable betrayal from your own blood, and you protected the legacy of this family with absolute perfect grace to the true future of Black excellence. The 47 relatives and the distinguished elders all raised their glasses in perfect unison, echoing the toast with joyous, enthusiastic voices. I smiled, leaning my head against the warm, solid shoulder of Jamal as I looked out over the beautiful, thriving neighborhood that my grandfather had loved so deeply. I had not just executed a flawless, satisfying revenge against the toxic mother and the cruel golden child sister who had tried to destroy my entire existence, had successfully secured my massive commercial empire. I had protected the sacred financial legacy of a great man, and I had definitively proven to the entire city that genuine Black excellence is built on hard work, profound integrity, and unshakable truth, not on the fake, shallow illusions of country club status and stolen money. The dark, heavy shadows of my painful childhood were completely permanently gone, leaving me standing in the bright, beautiful light of my own magnificent creation. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp, clean air fill my lungs and tightly squeezed the strong hand of the incredibly loving man standing right beside me. We were totally, completely, and unconditionally free to live our brilliant, beautiful lives. This brand new chapter was going to be absolutely spectacular, and I knew deep down in my soul that Grandpa Silas was smiling down on us right now. The central thematic lesson of this narrative revolves around the stark contrast between manufactured illusion and authentic power. At its core, the story teaches us that true legacy cannot be forged through manipulation, stolen wealth, or a desperate hunger for social validation. Rather, it is built from the ground up through quiet resilience, integrity, and hard work. In examining the character arcs, Beatrice, Preston, and Chantel serve as cautionary archetypes of how a toxic obsession with superficial status inevitably leads to absolute self-destruction. They sacrifice their moral compass, their genuine familial bonds, and their actual financial security just to project a flawless image to an elite society that did not truly care about them. Their catastrophic, public downfall perfectly illustrates that a life built on deceit and the exploitation of others is incredibly fragile, a house of cards destined to collapse under the crushing weight of the truth. Conversely, the protagonist and Grandpa Silas represent the triumph of substance over mere aesthetics. By choosing to step away from the country club charade, the protagonist focused on creating tangible value, working in the dirt to restore communities, and silently build a commercial empire. Her ultimate, deeply satisfying victory was not achieved through petty, loud vengeance. Instead, she won by establishing unyielding boundaries and letting her abuser's own unhinged greed and fraudulent actions completely dismantle their fake realities. Ultimately, this dramatic narrative reminds audiences that genuine excellence does not require a rented tuxedo, stolen credit cards, or forced applause. Authentic power always speaks for itself. When you stay true to your moral foundation and protect your inner peace, no amount of toxic gaslighting can tear down an empire built on undeniable truth. How do you plan to visually translate this powerful shift from the antagonist's fake glamour to the protagonist's grounded reality in your upcoming scene transitions?